Hey everybody, Corey here, your chess counselor, and today we're going to be talking about moving the bishops. So in addition to talking about how they move, I'm going to talk about a few special details. So let's get into it. Now you got your bishops, these are your bishops, right? If you look at the main board, you have two of them on your side and your opponent has two of them on their side, right? Now when we're moving bishops, it's pretty straightforward. They move diagonally and they only go one direction at a time. Right, so if I was to take this bishop here, which is on a darker square, it can only move on other dark squares because that's the diagonal, right? So if I wanted to move it all the way down here, I could. So the key thing to know here is that you can move diagonally as far or as little as you want. So if you only want to go one square, and that can be the end of your turn, you can do that. If you want to jump 2-3 squares, you can do that. You can also, you can also make a move and then move backwards as little or as far as you want. The only catch is if there's any piece in the way, you can't jump over that piece, right? So if we go back to our main board for a second, at the starting position, your bishop is behind these pawns. Like this bishop is behind these pawns, right? So you can't, on your first move, jump out of the way. If you wanted to move your bishop, you'd make a move by moving a pawn out the way. Remember, they move up 1 or 2 squares on their first move. Your opponent makes a move, and then now you can see that this diagonal is now opened up for you to move on. Now, if you find that your opponent, let's say, puts a piece anywhere on the diagonal of where your bishop can go, you can capture that piece by landing directly on top of it. Remember, this is not checkers. We're not jumping over it to capture it. We're landing directly on it. Now, another interesting thing is, let's say we just make some random moves here. You can see that these two pawns are both on your diagonal. Now, you cannot choose which one you want to capture. You would have to stop at the one that's directly in front of your bishop, right? So if you want to reach this pawn, you'd have to find another way around this pawn. If you want to capture something, you'd have to capture this one first. Now, you want to be careful because bishops are worth, let's say, 3.25 points is what people say. So they're worth about 3 pawns. In this case, strategically, you wouldn't want to take this pawn because, as we learned in a previous video, these pawns can move diagonally in one square and then capture your bishop. So it's like you traded one pawn for a bishop, which doesn't really seem to go too well for you, right? Because it seems like you're losing points, losing value. Think of it as if you're losing your officers versus a soldier, right? You want to keep those officers on duty. You don't want to sacrifice them unless you had some really great compensation for that, which we'll get into in another video. So back to bishops. So we've talked about how they move. They move diagonally. If you notice by looking at these bishops, they're all in different colors, right? So the bishop I've been talking about here is on dark squares. It'll always move on dark squares because it only moves diagonal. Your other bishop, your light square bishop, will only be on light squares. So these bishops will never be on the same square because they're on different colors and they only move diagonally. Same thing for your opponent's pieces. And now if we think about it, this dark squared bishop and this dark squared bishop are the only bishops that will ever intersect with each other. So for example, if let's see, whose turn is it? If I moved my bishop here, it would be on the same diagonal as your bishop. We'd be having a standoff. And whoever's turn it is would have the opportunity to take first, right? Assuming there's no other pieces on the board, that would be like something you could choose or you could not choose to do, right? But no matter how close I bring this other bishop, they will never be attacking one another. So that's something to keep in mind. Your dark squared bishop can only attack the other dark squared bishop. Their light squared bishop can only attack your light squared bishop. Now, additional detail I'll bring up, you might have heard before in some chess games, if you've ever been to a chess club, about the value of keeping a pair of bishops. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of like why that's so important necessarily, but I want you to just kind of understand that bishops working together work really well together. Like a bishop and knight can do some damage, but you probably ideally would like to have a bishop pair, meaning you have 2 bishops together. So for example, let's see whose turn is it here. Now this bishop and this bishop controls all of these diagonals, right? They control a lot of diagonals, a lot of space. And remembering that they can go backwards too, right? And if they're centralized, let's say we bring these two somewhat to the center. They control all of these diagonals together, which is going to be frustrating for your opponent to deal with. So if they are centralized or being used appropriately, then these bishops are really challenging to deal with because they're controlling so many different squares, and it increases all the options that you have. Not saying that without the bishop pair you're losing, but there's often a slight advantage for the player who has kept the bishop pair, meaning that your opponent, let's say you kept these two bishops and your opponent has a bishop and knight instead of two bishops at the end game. But we don't have to worry about that. I just kind of want to bring that awareness that there's some value when you're making decisions and holding on to your bishops. All right, so that's it for learning how to move the bishops with a couple special details. If I missed anything, please let me know in the comments, or if you have any questions about how to move the bishops, please let me know. Thanks.